Trying to blend any cultivar with Pinot Noir is a little like trying to perform a musical duet with System of a Down, because the original components that make System of a Down are so chaotic and unpredictable and complex in their own right that trying to add in another creative element from the outside usually ends in one of two tragic ways. Either you just create an unholy wall of noise not good for man nor beast, or that additional introduction of a new creative element is required to be so overpowering that you lose the beauty of that original combination. And so it is with Pinot Noir, because like the combination of Serge Tankian and Darren Malakian, Pinot Noir is already a kaleidoscopic wild ride in its own right, because Pinot Noir can have cherries and then dank forest floor and then roses and then blood and then aromatic cedar and then fungus. Pinot Noir essentially is a mental breakdown in a glass. But as we know from watching the Jerry Springer show, mental breakdowns, when channeled in the right direction, can make for spectacular entertainment. Now, given that we are Hand Drink Solo, a wine club that reviews curious wines for curious minds, we have found exactly such a wine. A Pinot Noir red blend that manages to not only deliver a sensory thrill, but also to somehow encapsulate a century of South African wine history. And really, this bottle kind of embodies the story of South African wine that has come to define it in the modern era. And what is this mythical beast? Well, it is the Beyerskloof TrailDust Red Blend, which is, as I said, an almost perfect three-part blend of Pinot Noir, Cinsault, and Pinotage. Now, if you think about that blend for too long, it becomes a little uncomfortable because you realize it is undeniably an incest wine, because you have two parents, Pinot Noir and Cinsault, who are then blended with their child Pinotage, all in one 750ml love fest. So who is the man responsible for this bizarre concoction? Well, in a name, it is Beyers Truter, known globally as the Prince of Pinotage. Now, at one point, he was the winemaker and cellar master at Canoncorp, and in 1989, he bottled a Pinotage that would go on to make South African wine history, because 2 years later, at the Diners Club International Wine Awards, that 1989 Pinotage won Beyers Truter the Robert Mondavi Trophy and title of International Winemaker of the Year. Now, South African winemakers from Canoncorp have actually gone on to win that a bunch of other times, but Beyers was the first one to do it, and soon after that he left Canoncorp and started his own kingdom, which was Beyerskloof. And Beyerskloof is a Stellenbosch estate that has become the kind of spiritual home of Pinotage ever since. And as for Beyers, he has spent his life championing the cultivar of Pinotage. The name TrailDust comes from a Louis L'Amour novel, and the quote is that trail dust is thicker than blood. And the thinking behind that is that when you've traveled a long distance or a long journey with someone or something, that you end up becoming closer than family. And so in some senses, TrailDust is a love letter from Beyers to Pinotage. But in another sense, it is Beyers highlighting this beautiful family relationship between Pinot Noir, Cinsault, and Pinotage. Because really, each one of these cultivars has actually popped up in very different chapters of South African wine history, and now they've been reunited in this really delicious red blend. But how delicious, you might say? All you've given us is history. So let's end the history and get into the glass. So when we give this guy a sniff, well, up front you do get an enormously engaging, very welcoming mix of red cherry and then a touch of deeper herbal fennel. Then coming in from a slightly different angle, you have this soft violet floral note, even a little bit of roses. And then, quite playfully, there's a beautiful raspberry sherbet note. So let's give it a sip and see what it's like on the palate. Well, as I say, blending with Pinot Noir is almost impossible, and yet it works so well in this particular context, because you have all the elegance and poise of Pinot Noir, and then you have the beautiful candied elements of Cinsault, and you have structure that comes from those world-famous tannins that Pinotage possesses. And even the color works. It's positively luminescent in the glass, but you've got a wine that is definitely darker than a standard Pinot Noir, but it's also much lighter and more translucent than a heavy inky Pinotage. It's this beautiful middle ground that catches the light just right. One of the most striking elements for me is the fact that this wine lingers just so long. And that tail end is kind of this beautiful experience where you are almost unable to figure out where one cultivar ends and the next one begins, because you have that cherry candy and that raspberry sherbet, which you'd think was from Cinsault, but then perhaps it's the blood orange juicy citrus element from Pinot Noir. It's really hard to tell, but maybe it doesn't matter. In fact, maybe that's the point. This wine is not just a red blend that is seamless, by the way, but it's also a complete family reunion with all the glorious mixed up chaos that those usually bring along with them. Now, if the idea of this wine is fascinating to you, then there are other wines like it that you should try and track down. Probably most notably would be Orpheus and Raven's number 42, which is made in a very different style, but with the exact same components. And in the meantime, while you pour yourself another glass, I'm going to leave links to 2 videos. One of them is the Haute Cabriolet Von Arnhem Red Blend, which is a mix of Pinot Noir and Syrah, equally fascinating. And the other is a link to a video about carbonic maceration pinotage in South Africa and the really exciting raft of wines that are coming out of that whole mixture of cultivar and winemaking techniques. Until next time, stay curious and always drink niche.